I never thought the words, "Can't this wait, we're busy," would shatter my world more than the windshield that just exploded in my face. Blood streaming down my forehead trapped in twisted metal, watching paramedics work frantically around me. The surgeon needed consent forms signed. I called my parents. Dad's text response made my broken ribs hurt less than my breaking heart. Mom didn't even answer. 26 years old, lying in an emergency room, realizing I was completely alone. That's when I called Grandpa Walter. The relief that washed over me when I heard Grandpa Walter's gravelly voice on the phone was like warm sunshine breaking through storm clouds. My hands shook as I held the hospital phone, fighting through the pain medication fog to explain what had happened. "Yvette, sweetheart, I'm leaving right now," he said without hesitation. "Don't you worry about a thing, Grandpa's coming." The contrast between his immediate response and my parents' cold dismissal hit me like a physical blow. 3 hours. That's how long it took him to drive from his farm in rural Pennsylvania to the trauma center in Philadelphia. 3 hours of him dropping everything, grabbing his truck keys, and racing down the highway to be with me. The accident had been brutal. A drunk driver ran a red light at 45 miles per hour, slamming into my Honda Civic as I drove home from work. The impact crushed the driver's side door, trapping me inside, while my car spun twice before hitting a telephone pole. Glass embedded in my scalp, 3 ribs cracked, and internal bleeding that required immediate surgery. When Grandpa Walter burst through those emergency room doors, his weathered face pale with worry, I started crying harder than I had since the accident. He was 78 years old, but he moved with the determination of a man half his age as he rushed to my bedside. "I'm here now, honey," he whispered, taking my bruised hand in his calloused farmer's hands. "You're going to be fine." The surgeon explained the severity of my internal injuries, while Grandpa listened intently, asking the right questions, signing the consent forms my own parents couldn't be bothered to handle. Dr. Martinez walked us through the 8-hour surgery. Ahead, the risks involved the recovery timeline. "She's lucky to be alive," Dr. Martinez said quietly. "A few more minutes of internal bleeding and we might have lost her." Grandpa never left my side during the surgery. When I woke up 12 hours later, groggy and disoriented, he was sitting in the uncomfortable chair beside my bed, still wearing the same flannel shirt and work boots he'd thrown on when I called. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" he asked, immediately alert despite having stayed awake all night. As the days passed in the hospital, Grandpa shared stories to keep my spirits up, brought me homemade soup in thermos containers, and handled all the insurance paperwork that overwhelmed me. But during one quiet evening, as rain patted against the hospital window, his expression grew sad. "You know, Yvette, it means the world to me that you called," he said, staring at his weathered hands. "I've been pretty lonely lately." My heart sank. "What do you mean, Grandpa?" He sighed deeply, the weight of unspoken pain evident in his voice. "Your parents, Robert and Patricia, they used to visit more often, but it's been almost 2 years since they've come to the farm. They live only 20 minutes away in suburban Pittsburgh, but they're always too busy with their new business venture." The revelation stunned me. My parents lived 20 minutes from Grandpa Walter, and they hadn't visited in 2 years, while he was alone on that big farm managing everything by himself at 78 years old. "What kind of business?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. Grandpa shrugged, confusion clouding his features. "They call it Heritage Treasures LLC, something about buying and selling antiques, estate sale items. They mentioned it brings in good money, but they've never really explained what they do. Every time I ask, they change the subject." A cold feeling settled in my stomach that had nothing to do with my injuries. Heritage Treasures LLC. My parents had never mentioned starting any business to me. In fact, the last few times I'd talked to them, they'd complained about money being tight, about needing to cut back on expenses. "They promised to visit." Grandpa continued, his voice growing quieter. "Patricia always says they'll come for Sunday dinner, but then something comes up. Robert claims their business keeps them traveling, buying inventory. I just miss having family around, you know." The twist of realization hit me like another car crash. My parents had abandoned not just me in my moment of crisis, but they'd been systematically abandoning Grandpa Walter for 2 years. While I'd been busy with my marketing job and social life assuming they were taking care of him, they'd been neglecting the man who'd just dropped everything to save my life. 3 days into my hospital stay, my best friend Madison arrived with Flowers magazines and a puzzled expression that immediately put me on alert. Madison worked in digital marketing and spent hours browsing online auction sites for vintage finds, so when she hesitated before speaking, I knew something was wrong. "Yvette, I need to ask you something weird," she said, setting down a bouquet of sunflowers. "Are your parents selling family stuff online?" My blood went cold. "What do you mean?" Madison pulled out her phone, scrolling through saved screenshots. "I was browsing estate sale listings yesterday when I saw some items that looked really familiar. The seller name was Heritage Treasures, LLC. My heart stopped. That was the business name Grandpa had mentioned, the mysterious venture my parents claimed kept them so busy. "Show me," I whispered. The first photo made me gasp. It was Grandpa's antique mantel clock, the one that had belonged to his grandmother and sat on his fireplace mantel for as long as I could remember. The listing described it as estate sale find excellent condition. Victorian timepiece starting bid $50. "Keep scrolling," Madison said grimly. Photo after photo revealed family treasures I recognized from Grandpa's house. Great-grandmother's china set with the delicate rose pattern, the vintage quilts Grandma had hand-sewn during the 1940s, military medals from Grandpa's service in Korea, family photographs in ornate silver frames, some dating back to the early 1900s. "There are dozens of listings," Madison continued, her voice filled with disbelief. "They've been selling items regularly for months. Look at this one." She showed me a listing for Grandma's jewelry box, a wooden treasure chest carved with intricate flowers that Grandpa had made for his late wife on their 20th wedding anniversary. The description read, "Handcrafted vintage jewelry box, perfect for antique lovers, starting bid $35. My hands trembled as I processed what I was seeing. My parents weren't just running some legitimate antique business. They were stealing family heirlooms from Grandpa Walter and selling them online as estate sale finds. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked, though my voice barely functioned. Madison had already calculated the numbers. Based on completed sales, I can track they've made at least $12,000 in the past 6 months alone. And these are just the items I recognized from photos you've shown me over the years. The room spun around me, and not from the pain medication. My parents, who'd refused to come to the hospital when I nearly died, had been systematically robbing the grandfather who'd just saved my life. While Grandpa Walter sat alone in his farmhouse, wondering why his son and daughter-in-law never visited, they were quietly looting his treasured possessions. "There's more," Madison said reluctantly. "I created an account to track their activity. They've been posting new items every few days, always described as estate sale finds or inherited pieces. But Yvette, your grandfather, is still alive." The horrifying implication crashed over me. My parents were essentially conducting an estate sale while Grandpa was still living, turning his lifetime of memories into profit margins. Every family photo, every piece of handcrafted furniture, every memento from his 50-year marriage to Grandma was just inventory to them. When Madison left that evening, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing despite the exhaustion. I had to tell Grandpa Walter what I'd discovered, but how do you explain to someone that their own son is stealing their most precious belongings? The next morning, when Grandpa arrived with homemade breakfast and his usual cheerful demeanor, I couldn't bear to see him smiling while being betrayed. "Grandpa, I need to show you something," I said carefully. I walked him through Madison's screenshots, watching his face transform from confusion to disbelief to heartbreak. When he saw the listing for Grandma's jewelry box, his hands started shaking. "But I've been looking for this everywhere," he whispered. "I wanted to give it to you someday. I thought maybe I'd misplaced it when I reorganized the bedroom." "Grandpa, they've been taking things when they visit," I said gently. The business they mentioned, Heritage Treasures, LLC, it's your family heirlooms they're selling. He stared at the phone screen showing his late wife's jewelry box listed for sale, and I watched 78 years of trusting love crumble in his eyes. The man who'd raised my father, who'd opened his home to my parents countless times, who'd just spent 3 sleepless days in a hospital chair caring for his granddaughter, was discovering that his own son was robbing him blind. "I don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "Why would they do this? If they needed money, they could have just asked." The devastating twist wasn't just the theft itself, but the calculation behind it. My parents had been using their rare visits to systematically identify and remove the most valuable items, knowing Grandpa trusted them completely. They'd turned his love and hospitality into opportunities for profit. As Grandpa sat in stunned silence processing the betrayal, I realized this was only the beginning of what we were going to uncover. The phone call to my parents the next morning was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. My hands shook as I dialed their number from my hospital bed with Grandpa Walter sitting beside me for moral support. Part of me hoped there was some misunderstanding, some explanation that would make sense of what we'd discovered. Dad answered on the third ring, his voice casual and unconcerned. "Oh, Yvette, how are you feeling? We've been meaning to call back." The audacity of his tone, as if my near-death experience was a minor inconvenience they'd gotten around to acknowledging, made my blood boil. But I forced myself to stay calm. "Dad, I need to ask you about Heritage Treasures, LLC, I said directly. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted to defensive. "What about it? It's just a little side business we've been working on." "You've been selling Grandpa's family heirlooms online," I said, watching Grandpa's face crumple at hearing the words spoken aloud. "Now hold on just a minute," Dad said, his tone becoming aggressive. "We're not selling anything that isn't ours to sell. We're helping your grandfather by preserving family history. Those items were just sitting around collecting dust, and we're making sure they go to people who will appreciate them." The twisted logic stunned me. "Appreciate them, Dad. You sold Grandma's jewelry box for $35. That was handmade by Grandpa as an anniversary gift." Mom's voice suddenly joined the conversation as she picked up the extension. "Yvette, you're being dramatic. We're investing the money wisely for your grandfather's eventual care needs. We're thinking ahead to when he'll need assisted living or medical expenses." "By stealing his belongings without permission?" I asked, incredulous. "We're not stealing anything," Dad shot back. "We have power of attorney documents that give us the legal right to manage his affairs. We're being responsible by liquidating assets that will just depreciate in value." My heart stopped. Power of attorney documents. Grandpa Walter looked at me with confusion, shaking his head silently. "What power of attorney?" Grandpa whispered, but I shushed him gently. Mom continued explaining their justification with chilling, matter-of-fact tone. "When your grandfather had pneumonia last year, we had the foresight to get proper legal documentation in place. The doctor said he could have complications, and we needed to be prepared to make decisions for his welfare. Those decisions apparently include selling his dead wife's possessions on eBay," I said, unable to hide my disgust. "You're being overly emotional because of your accident," Dad said dismissively. "When you're thinking clearly, you'll understand we're protecting family assets. We're preventing them from being lost or damaged." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with my parents presenting increasingly elaborate justifications for their actions. They claimed they were preserving family history by selling heirlooms to collectors. They insisted they were investing wisely by converting sentimental items into liquid assets. They maintained they were helping Grandpa by managing his possessions responsibly. But the most chilling revelation came when Mom said, "We'll discuss this properly when you're discharged from the hospital and thinking rationally. Right now, you're clearly not in the right frame of mind to understand complex financial planning." They refused to visit me in the hospital even after learning I'd nearly died. They refused to return any of the stolen items. And they made it clear They considered their actions completely justified under legal documents Grandpa couldn't even remember signing. When I hung up the phone, Grandpa Walter looked like he'd aged 10 years in 30 minutes. "Yvette, I don't remember signing any power of attorney papers," he said quietly. "When I had pneumonia, I was so sick I could barely stay awake. The whole week is fuzzy in my memory." The devastating twist hit me like a physical blow. Not only were my parents stealing from Grandpa, but they'd obtained legal authorization to do so when he was too sick to understand what he was signing. They'd taken advantage of his illness, his trust, and his love to gain control over his possessions and finances. They planned this. I whispered the full scope of their betrayal becoming clear. They waited until you were vulnerable, got you to sign documents you didn't understand, and then used those papers to justify stealing everything you treasure. As Grandpa sat in shocked silence processing the calculated nature of his son's betrayal, I realized we weren't just dealing with opportunistic theft. We were facing a deliberate long-term plan to systematically strip him of everything he owned while maintaining the legal appearance of legitimacy. The question now was, what else had they done that we hadn't discovered yet? Madison arrived the next morning armed with her laptop and a determined expression that meant business. As a digital marketing specialist, she had research skills that proved invaluable as we started digging deeper into my parents' scheme. "I spent all night investigating this," she said, setting up her computer on the hospital tray table. "What I found is going to make you sick." While Grandpa Walter dozed in his chair, exhausted from the emotional trauma of yesterday's revelations, Madison walked me through her findings. She'd created spreadsheets tracking my parents' online sales, documented timelines, and most importantly, researched the legal implications of power of attorney fraud. "First, let's talk about the timing," she said, pulling up a calendar. "Your grandfather was hospitalized with pneumonia on March 15th last year. He was discharged March 22nd. The power of attorney documents were filed with the county clerk on March 16th. My stomach dropped. He was filed the day after he was admitted. Gets worse. I called the hospital pretending to be researching medical billing. They transferred me to medical records and I explained I was trying to verify dates for insurance purposes. The nurse mentioned that patients with pneumonia that severe are typically heavily sedated and disoriented for the first several days of treatment. Madison pulled up hospital documentation she'd somehow obtained through her research skills. The medical notes clearly indicated Grandpa had been on heavy antibiotics and sedation medications that would have severely impaired his cognitive function during his first 3 days of hospitalization. Yvette, there's no way he was mentally competent to understand and sign legal documents on March 16th. The medical records show he was heavily medicated and experiencing delirium from the infection. But the most damning evidence came when Madison showed me the actual power of attorney documents, which she'd accessed through public record searches. "Look at this signature," she said, zooming in on the document. "Now look at this birthday card your grandfather signed for you last month." The signatures were completely different. The power of attorney signature was shaky, uneven, and missing several characteristic flourishes that appeared in all of Grandpa's normal signatures. Most telling, the legal document signature looked forced, as if someone had guided his hand while he was barely conscious. "This is fraud," I breathed. "They forged his signature or coerced him to sign while he was sedated." Madison nodded grimly. "I contacted a lawyer friend who specializes in elder law. She looked at the documents and said they would never hold up in court. The timing alone creates reasonable doubt, but combined with the medical records and handwriting analysis, it's clearly fraudulent." We spent the next 2 hours documenting everything. Madison had tracked down bank records showing exactly where the money from stolen heirlooms had gone. Instead of being invested for Grandpa's care, as my parents claimed, every penny had gone into their personal checking accounts and credit card payments. "They've sold nearly $15,000 worth of family heirlooms over the past year," Madison reported. "The money paid for their vacation to Florida, a new truck for your dad, and shopping sprees for your mom. None of it went toward your grandfather's care or future needs." When Grandpa Walter woke up and we showed him the evidence, he stared at the forged signature for a long time. "I remember being so confused that week," he said softly. "The nurses kept asking me questions I couldn't focus on. Someone did bring papers for me to sign, but I thought they were just hospital forms for treatment." "Do you remember who brought the papers?" I asked. His expression grew pained. "Robert was there. Your father. He said something about insurance paperwork, that it was routine documentation the hospital needed. I was so sick I just signed whatever he put in front of me." The devastating twist wasn't just that my parents had committed fraud, but that they'd exploited Grandpa's trust and illness with calculated precision. They'd waited for him to be at his most vulnerable, used his faith in their honesty against him, and turned his medical crisis into an opportunity to gain control over his assets. Madison contacted her lawyer friend again, this time with all our evidence. The attorney agreed to meet with us the following day and confirmed that we had grounds for criminal charges, including elder fraud forgery and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. "But here's what really bothers me," Madison said as we wrapped up our research session. "If they were willing to do this to get power of attorney, what else have they done that you haven't discovered yet?" As if summoned by her words, Grandpa's neighbor Dorothy knocked on the hospital room door. She was a 75-year-old woman who lived on the farm adjacent to Grandpa's property, and her worried expression immediately put me on alert. "Walter, I'm so glad you're okay," she said, hugging Grandpa gently. "I've been wanting to talk to you about something, but I wasn't sure if I should get involved in family business." "What is it, Dorothy?" Grandpa asked. She glanced around nervously before speaking. "It's about that conversation I overheard 6 months ago between you and Robert, about changing your will." My blood turned to ice. They'd changed his will too. The nightmare was just getting started. Dorothy's words hung in the hospital room like a death sentence. The elderly neighbor shifted uncomfortably in her floral dress, clearly wrestling with whether she should reveal what she'd witnessed. "Dorothy, please tell me what you heard," Grandpa said gently, though his voice carried a tremor of dread. She took a deep breath and sat down in the extra chair Madison had pulled over. "It was back in June, around dinner time. I was working in my garden when I heard voices coming from your back porch. Robert and Patricia were there with you, and they were talking about your will." My heart pounded as Dorothy continued her account. "Robert was saying something about how Yvette was too young and financially irresponsible to inherit the farm. He said she'd probably sell it to developers or let it fall into disrepair. Patricia agreed, saying, 'Young people today don't understand the value of hard work or preserving family land.'" Grandpa's face went pale. I don't remember that conversation very clearly. My memory has been fuzzy about a lot of things lately. "They were very persuasive." Dorothy continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "They painted a picture of Yvette as someone who would waste everything you'd worked for. Robert suggested that leaving the farm to them would ensure it stayed in the family and was properly maintained. They said they'd eventually pass it down to Yvette when she was more mature. The manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. My parents had convinced Grandpa that I was irresponsible and undeserving, all while they were actively stealing from him behind his back." "What else did they say?" Madison asked, taking notes on her laptop. Dorothy's expression grew troubled. "Patricia mentioned that 300 acres of prime farmland was worth significant money, especially with development pressure in the area. She suggested that leaving it to Yvette would be like throwing away the family legacy, but leaving it to them would preserve it for future generations." 300 acres! I gasped. I'd known Grandpa owned farmland, but I'd never realized the scope of the property. Grandpa nodded sadly. "The farm has been in our family for 4 generations. With current land values and development pressure from the expanding suburbs, it's worth close to $800,000. $800,000! My parents hadn't just been stealing family heirlooms worth thousands. They'd manipulated Grandpa into changing his will to give them nearly $1 million in farmland that was supposed to be my inheritance." "There's more," Dorothy said reluctantly. I actually took some pictures that day because I was documenting damage to my fence from the storm the night before. I didn't mean to photograph your conversation, but I caught Robert carrying boxes from your house to his truck." She pulled out her smartphone, scrolling through photos from 6 months ago. The images clearly showed my father loading cardboard boxes into his pickup truck while my mother supervised from the porch. "I thought maybe you were giving them some of your late wife's things as keepsakes," Dorothy explained. "But now, knowing what you've told me about the online sales, I'm wondering if that's when they took the items they've been selling." Madison immediately asked Dorothy to email her the photos. The timestamps would provide crucial evidence linking my parents to the systematic removal of Grandpa's possessions. "Dorothy, did you hear anything else about the will changes?" I asked. She nodded reluctantly. "Robert mentioned they'd already talked to an attorney about updating the documents. He said something about making sure everything was legally proper so there wouldn't be any complications later." Patricia laughed and said it was good they were thinking ahead since family disputes over estates can get ugly. The premeditation was chilling. My parents hadn't just spontaneously decided to steal from Grandpa. They'd developed a comprehensive plan to gain control of his assets, manipulate his testamentary wishes, and eliminate my inheritance entirely. When Dorothy left that evening promising to provide any additional help needed, we sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of my parents' betrayal. "Grandpa, do you remember changing your will?" I asked gently. He rubbed his forehead, struggling to recall events. "Bits and pieces. Robert did bring some papers about estate planning. He said it was important to have updated documents as I got older. The attorney came to the house, which seemed convenient at the time." "The attorney came to your house?" Madison asked sharply. "Yes, Robert arranged it. Said it would be easier for me than driving to an office. The lawyer seemed nice enough, though I was feeling pretty tired that day. I'd been having some dizzy spells and my blood pressure medication was making me foggy." Another red flag. Legitimate attorneys typically prefer clients to come to their offices for important document signings, partly to ensure the client is acting without coercion and understands the implications of their decisions. Madison's research skills proved invaluable again as she started investigating the attorney who'd handled Grandpa's will changes. Within an hour, she'd uncovered disturbing information. "The lawyer who came to your house is named Bradley Stevens," she reported. "He's been disciplined twice by the State Bar Association for questionable practices involving elderly clients. There are complaints filed against him for pressure tactics and inadequate explanation of legal documents. So my parents specifically chose a lawyer known for taking advantage of elderly people," I said, the pattern becoming clearer. "It gets worse," Madison continued. "Stevens operates what's essentially a mobile estate planning service, going to people's homes to update wills and power of attorney documents. Several families have filed complaints claiming he works with adult children to manipulate elderly parents into changing their estates." We contacted Detective Harrison from the county sheriff's office who specialized in elder fraud cases. When we explained the situation and provided our evidence, his response was immediate. "This fits a pattern we've been tracking," Detective Harrison said during his visit to the hospital. "We've had several similar cases over the past 2 years involving elderly victims who had their estates manipulated by adult children, working with unscrupulous attorneys." "Are my parents part of some kind of organized scheme?" I asked. Detective Harrison nodded grimly. "Heritage Treasures LLC has appeared in connection with 3 other elder fraud cases. We believe your parents are part of a network that targets vulnerable elderly people, gains legal control of their assets, and systematically liquidates their possessions." The devastating twist wasn't just that my parents were thieves, but that they were professional thieves, operating as part of an organized criminal enterprise that specialized in destroying families and exploiting the elderly. As Detective Harrison explained the scope of the investigation, I realized that Grandpa Walter and I weren't just victims of family betrayal. We were casualties in a systematic criminal operation that had been destroying lives throughout our community. The fight was about to get much bigger than just recovering stolen heirlooms. 2 days after Detective Harrison's visit, I was finally discharged from the hospital. Grandpa Walter insisted I recover at his farmhouse, where he could take proper care of me. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that the man my parents had been robbing was the only family member offering genuine support during my recovery. The farmhouse sat on rolling hills 30 minutes outside Pittsburgh, surrounded by 300 acres of the most beautiful land I'd ever seen. Golden wheat fields stretched toward tree-lined ridges, while the old 2-story house stood proudly with its wraparound porch and hand-carved details that spoke of 4 generations of family craftsmanship. "This is what they want to steal," I murmured as Grandpa helped me settle into the guest bedroom that had been my father's room as a child. "It's been in our family since 1892, Grandpa said quietly. "My great-grandfather cleared this land by hand, built the original cabin that became the foundation for this house. Every generation has added something, improved, something preserved, something for the next family members to inherit." Being in the house made the theft more personal. I could see gaps on shelves where family photos used to sit, empty spaces on walls, where antique frames had hung missing pieces, in china cabinets that told the story of systematic looting. On my 3rd day at the farm, a white sedan pulled into the gravel driveway. Through the front window, I watched my parents get out of their car, followed by a woman in a business suit carrying an official-looking clipboard. "They're here," I told Grandpa, who was making lunch in the kitchen. His face went pale. I wasn't expecting them. Dad knocked firmly on the front door, not bothering to wait for an invitation before walking inside. He'd clearly been coming and going from this house as he pleased for months, treating it like his personal storage facility rather than his father's home. "Dad, we need to talk." Robert said, his voice carrying an authoritative tone I'd never heard him use with Grandpa before. "This is Ms. Jennifer Walsh from Adult Protective Services." The woman in the suit stepped forward, consulting her clipboard with professional efficiency. "Mr. Walter Hoffman, I'm here to conduct a wellness evaluation based on concerns raised about your ability to live independently." My blood ran cold. They were trying to have Grandpa declared incompetent. Mom stepped forward with fake concern plastered across her face. "We're worried about your safety, Dad. You're 78 years old, living alone on this big farm. What if you fell and nobody found you for days? What if you forgot to turn off the stove and started a fire?" "I'm perfectly fine," Grandpa said firmly, but I could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. Dad pulled out a folder thick with documents. "We've already spoken with an attorney about guardianship proceedings. Dr. Mitchell has agreed to perform a competency evaluation, and we've identified 3 excellent assisted living facilities that can provide the professional care you need." The attack was swift and coordinated. They'd spent weeks planning this assault on Grandpa's independence, arranging professional support for their claims, and preparing legal documents to strip him of control over his own life. Furthermore, Mom continued with chilling efficiency, "We've discovered that someone has been filling your head with paranoid delusions about our family business. We're concerned that isolation has made you susceptible to conspiracy theories and false accusations." Ms. Walsh from Adult Protective Services took notes while my parents painted a picture of a confused elderly man who was no longer capable of making rational decisions about his welfare. "The house needs significant repairs," Dad said, gesturing around the kitchen. "The electrical system is outdated, the plumbing has problems, and the heating system is inefficient. It's not safe for an elderly person to live here alone." "I can take care of myself just fine," Grandpa protested, but his voice lacked confidence. "Dad, last month you called us because you couldn't remember where you put your car keys," Mom said with practiced concern. "You've been having dizzy spells, your blood pressure medication makes you foggy, and you've lost weight because you're not eating properly." Every statement contained just enough truth to sound legitimate, but twisted to support their narrative of incompetence. Yes, Grandpa occasionally misplaced his keys like everyone does. Yes, his blood pressure medication sometimes made him tired. But they were using normal aspects of aging to build a case for legal incapacity. "We've already toured several facilities." Dad continued pulling out glossy brochures. Sunset Manor has excellent reviews and specializes in caring for patients with early-stage dementia. They have 24-hour medical supervision, recreational activities, and nutritious meal plans. I don't have dementia, Grandpa said, his voice growing stronger. Dad denial is often the first sign that intervention is necessary, Mom replied with fake patience. We're not trying to hurt you. We love you and want what's best for your safety and health. Ms. Walsh from Adult Protective Services continued taking notes, asking questions about Grandpa's daily routines, his medical care, and his living conditions. My parents had clearly briefed her in advance because her questions seemed designed to highlight potential problems rather than assess genuine competence. Mr. Hoffman, when was your last medical checkup? She asked. About 6 months ago, Grandpa replied honestly. And what medications are you currently taking? As Grandpa struggled to remember the exact names of his blood pressure and cholesterol medications, my parents exchanged meaningful glances that suggested his minor confusion proved their point. Dad, this is exactly what we're worried about, Robert said. You can't keep track of your medications, you haven't seen a doctor recently, and you're living in isolation without proper support systems. The devastating twist was watching how skillfully they manipulated normal aspects of aging into evidence of incompetence. They turned his medication confusion into dementia symptoms, his independent living into dangerous isolation, and his trust in family into vulnerability that required professional intervention. We've already spoken with the bank about establishing a conservatorship to protect your financial assets, Mom added. With your cognitive decline, you're vulnerable to financial exploitation by people who might take advantage of your confusion. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The people who'd been systematically stealing from Grandpa for over a year were now claiming they needed legal authority to protect him from financial exploitation. As they presented their case for moving him to assisted living, I realized this wasn't just about gaining control of his assets. They wanted him helpless and isolated, unable to discover the full extent of their theft, while they liquidated everything he owned under the legal authority of guardianship. We can have you move to Sunset Manor by next week, Dad said with finality. Ms. Walsh will file her report, Dr. Mitchell will complete the competency evaluation, and our attorney will handle the guardianship paperwork. And what about the farm? Grandpa asked quietly. Mom smiled with false reassurance. Don't worry about the property. We'll handle everything. You won't need to concern yourself with maintenance and taxes anymore. The plan was crystal clear. Within weeks, they intended to have Grandpa declared incompetent, moved to institutional care, and stripped of all control over his property and finances. Then they could liquidate his assets without interference, selling the $800,000 farm while he sat helpless in a nursing home. As they prepared to leave, Dad handed Grandpa a thick stack of papers. Look these over and we'll discuss everything tomorrow. The sooner we get this process started, the sooner we can ensure your safety. When their car disappeared down the gravel driveway, Grandpa Walter sat in his kitchen chair looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen him. Maybe they're right, he said quietly. Maybe I am too old to live alone anymore. The cruelest aspect of their attack was how it undermined his confidence in his own capabilities. They'd taken a proud, independent man who'd been successfully managing his life and convinced him that he was incompetent and dangerous to himself. Looking at the legal documents they'd left behind, I realized we were facing a coordinated assault that would strip Grandpa of everything he valued: his independence, his home, his possessions, and his dignity. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the lengths I would go to protect the man who'd saved my life when they wouldn't even answer their phone. The war was about to begin in earnest. The next morning, as Grandpa and I sat at his kitchen table trying to make sense of the legal documents my parents had left behind, an unexpected visitor arrived. A black Mercedes sedan pulled into the gravel driveway and a distinguished man in his 60s stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. "Are you expecting someone?" I asked Grandpa. He shook his head, looking puzzled as he peered through the window. The man knocked politely on the front door and introduced himself with a warm but professional demeanor. "Good morning. I'm Thomas Richardson, the family attorney who handled your father's estate planning for over 20 years. I've been trying to reach you for several months, Mr. Hoffman." Grandpa's expression brightened with recognition. "Thomas, I remember you from when you helped us with Martha's estate after she passed. Please come in." Thomas Richardson looked exactly like what you'd expect from a longtime family attorney: silver hair, conservative suit, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of dignified presence that commanded respect. He accepted Grandpa's offer of coffee and settled into the living room with the comfortable familiarity of an old friend. "Mr. Hoffman, I need to discuss some concerning irregularities I've discovered in your recent estate planning documents," he said, opening his briefcase with deliberate care. My heart began racing. What kind of irregularities? Thomas pulled out a thick folder and spread several documents across the coffee table. "I've been your family's attorney for over 2 decades. I drafted your original will 5 years ago, handled your wife's estate, and maintained copies of all your important legal documents in my files." He pointed to the will my parents had pressured Grandpa to sign 6 months earlier. "This document claiming to update your estate planning contains several elements that raise serious legal questions." "Such as?" I asked, leaning forward intently. "First, the witness signatures don't match any of the usual witnesses we use for document execution. Second, several clauses contradict specific instructions you gave me when we drafted your original will. Third, the handwriting analysis on your signature shows characteristics inconsistent with your normal signing patterns." Thomas opened another folder containing Grandpa's original estate planning documents from 5 years earlier. "In your original will, you specifically stated that the farm should remain with Yvette to preserve the family legacy. You were very clear about wanting the land to stay in the bloodline rather than passing to children who might sell it for development." Grandpa stared at the 2 documents side by side, confusion evident on his weathered features. "I remember having very strong feelings about keeping the farm in the family. Martha and I talked about it many times before she passed." "Exactly," Thomas confirmed. "You and your late wife were adamant that the farm should go to your granddaughter because you felt she had the deepest connection to the land and family history. You specifically mentioned concerns that Robert and Patricia might sell the property." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Not only had my parents manipulated Grandpa into changing his will, but they'd completely reversed his actual wishes about preserving the family legacy. "There are additional problems." Thomas continued pulling out more documents. "The power of attorney papers filed with the county clerk contain witness signatures that don't match our records for legitimate document execution. More importantly, I never drafted these documents despite them claiming to be prepared by my law firm." "You didn't prepare the power of attorney?" I asked. "Absolutely not. My firm maintains strict protocols for power of attorney documents, especially those involving elderly clients. We require multiple meetings, waiting periods, and independent verification that the client understands the implications of granting such authority." Thomas showed us copies of the fraudulent documents pointing out inconsistencies in formatting, legal language, and procedural requirements. These documents were obviously prepared by someone else, but designed to look like they came from my office. The letterhead is slightly different. The signature blocks don't match our standard format, and the notary stamps are from officials we don't typically work with. The implications were staggering. My parents hadn't just manipulated Grandpa into signing questionable documents. They'd worked with another attorney to create completely fraudulent papers designed to impersonate legitimate legal work. "Furthermore," Thomas continued, "I've been investigating similar cases after several other families contacted my office with concerns about questionable estate planning involving elderly family members." "Other families?" I asked. Thomas nodded gravely. "Over the past 6 months, I've been contacted by 4 different families reporting situations remarkably similar to yours. Elderly parents who supposedly signed power of attorney documents during medical emergencies, wills that were changed under suspicious circumstances, and systematic liquidation of family assets by adult children claiming legal authority." He opened another folder containing case summaries that made my blood run cold. The Patterson family from Allegheny County. 82-year-old Margaret Patterson supposedly signed power of attorney documents while recovering from hip surgery. Her son liquidated her antique collection and sold her house within 6 months. The Williams family from Butler County. 79-year-old James Williams had his estate planning updated after a minor stroke, leaving everything to his daughter instead of his grandchildren as originally planned. "Are you saying this is part of some kind of organized scheme?" Grandpa asked. "I believe we're dealing with a sophisticated elder fraud network," Thomas confirmed. The same attorney's name appears on questionable documents in multiple cases. The same notary stamps appear on suspicious power of attorney papers across 3 counties, and several families report their elderly relatives' possessions being sold through similar online businesses. Thomas pulled out one final document that made my heart stop. It was a business registration filing showing that Bradley Stevens, the attorney who'd changed Grandpa's will, was listed as a partner in an LLC called Estate Transition Services. Stevens operates what's essentially a mobile estate planning service, targeting elderly individuals during medical vulnerabilities. He works with adult children to manipulate estate documents, provides legal cover for asset liquidation, and helps families gain control over elderly relatives' finances. The devastating twist wasn't just that my parents were thieves, but that they were part of a professional criminal enterprise with legal expertise and established procedures for exploiting vulnerable elderly people across multiple counties. "How many families are we talking about?" I asked, dreading the answer. Based on my investigation and cooperation with law enforcement, we estimate at least 15 families have been victimized over the past 2 years. Total financial losses are approaching $500,000 in stolen assets and manipulated inheritances. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of professional determination and personal disgust. The most disturbing aspect is the psychological manipulation involved. These criminals don't just steal money and possessions, they destroy trust between family members, isolate elderly victims from legitimate support systems, and leave lasting emotional trauma that affects entire families. As Thomas packed up his documents, he handed me his business card with a reassuring smile. "I want you to know that we're going to fight this. I've already contacted the district attorney's office and provided evidence of the fraudulent documents. We have grounds for criminal charges, including elder fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and racketeering under organized crime statutes." "What happens next?" Grandpa asked. "Next, we restore your legitimate estate planning documents, file criminal complaints against everyone involved in this scheme, and work with law enforcement to protect other potential victims." Thomas paused at the door, his expression growing more serious. "But I need to warn you both. When criminals realize their scheme has been exposed, they often escalate their efforts to gain control before law enforcement can intervene. Be prepared for your parents to take more aggressive action in the coming days." As his Mercedes disappeared down the gravel driveway, I realized we'd just gained a powerful ally in our fight. But Thomas's warning echoed in my mind as I wondered what desperate measures my parents might attempt when they discovered their elaborate criminal scheme was unraveling. Detective Harrison's phone call came at 7:30 the next morning, waking both Grandpa and me from restless sleep. His voice carried the energy of someone who'd been working all night on a major case breakthrough. "Yvette, I need you and your grandfather to come to the sheriff's office this morning. We've made some significant discoveries about your parents' operation that change everything about this case." 2 hours later, we sat in Detective Harrison's office surrounded by evidence boards, computer monitors, and stacks of documents that painted a picture far more sinister than anything we'd imagined. Heritage Treasures, LLC is just the tip of the iceberg. Detective Harrison began pulling up a complex organizational chart on his computer screen. Your parents are part of a multi-county criminal enterprise that's been systematically targeting elderly residents across western Pennsylvania. The chart showed connections between dozens of names, businesses, and locations. At the center was a network of interconnected LLCs, all sharing similar business models and operating procedures. We've identified at least 17 different business entities operating under this umbrella, Detective Harrison continued. Heritage Treasures Estate Transition Services, Family Legacy Preservation, Heirloom Solutions, Senior Asset Management, all different names but the same core group of people running elaborate elder fraud schemes. Madison, who'd driven out from Pittsburgh to provide moral support, stared at the evidence in disbelief. How long has this been going on? Based on financial records and victim statements, at least 3 years. But we suspect the operation has been growing and becoming more sophisticated over time. Detective Harrison pulled up photographs that made my stomach turn. They showed warehouse spaces filled with stolen family heirlooms, antiques, and personal possessions organized like inventory in a retail operation. We executed search warrants early this morning on 3 storage facilities connected to the network. What we found was essentially a massive fencing operation for stolen family treasures. Photo after photo revealed the scope of the theft. Entire rooms filled with antique furniture, china cabinets stuffed with family heirloom dishware jewelry displays containing hundreds of pieces of estate jewelry, and walls lined with family photographs dating back over a century. We estimate the total value of recovered items at over $200,000, Detective Harrison said. And this represents only what we found in the storage facilities. Much more has already been sold through online auction sites and antique dealers. Grandpa Walter stared at photos of familiar items mixed in with strangers' family treasures. His late wife's china set sat next to another family's silver service. Great-grandmother's quilts were folded beside vintage clothing from completely different families. How do they find their victims? I asked. Detective Harrison pulled up another screen showing the sophisticated targeting methods used by the criminal network. They identify potential victims through multiple sources: hospital admission records, obituary notices, social media posts about elderly family members, community newsletters mentioning seniors living alone. They also cultivate relationships with healthcare workers, nursing home employees, and even funeral directors who provide tips about vulnerable families. So this isn't just opportunistic theft, Madison observed. This is systematic predatory targeting. Exactly. Once they identify a target, they research family dynamics to find adult children who might be susceptible to financial pressure or family conflicts that can be exploited. Detective Harrison showed us detailed profiles the criminals had compiled on their victims, including financial information, family relationships, medical conditions, and psychological vulnerabilities. In your grandfather's case, they knew about your father's employment history, your mother's spending habits, your family's financial pressures, and your grandfather's isolation after your grandmother's death. They used all of this information to craft their approach. The level of research and planning was terrifying. These weren't simple thieves looking for easy targets. They were professional criminals who studied their victims like military intelligence analysts planning complex operations. The network includes corrupt legal professionals who provide fraudulent documentation, healthcare workers who identify vulnerable patients' family members who provide access to victims' homes, and antique dealers who help launder stolen goods. Detective Harrison pulled up records showing the sophisticated money laundering operation used to convert stolen goods into untraceable cash. Stolen items are sold through multiple channels to obscure their origins: online auction sites, antique shows, estate sale companies, even legitimate retail stores that unknowingly purchase stolen inventory from apparently legitimate wholesalers. How much money are we talking about? Grandpa asked quietly. Conservative estimates suggest this network has generated over $800,000 in revenue over 3 years. But the true cost to victims includes not just financial losses, but destroyed family relationships, emotional trauma, and loss of irreplaceable family history. The devastating twist wasn't just the scale of the criminal operation, but the calculated cruelty involved in destroying families while profiting from their pain. We've arrested 12 individuals this morning on charges ranging from elder fraud to racketeering, Detective Harrison continued. Your parents are among those currently in custody, along with Bradley Stevens and several other key figures in the network. Relief washed over me knowing my parents were finally facing consequences for their actions, but Detective Harrison's next revelation sent chills down my spine. However, we believe there are additional networks operating in other regions using similar methods to target elderly victims. This investigation has uncovered what appears to be a statewide elder fraud epidemic that's been largely invisible until now. He showed us maps indicating similar criminal patterns in Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Erie, and other Pennsylvania cities. The methodology is so effective and profitable that it's being replicated by different criminal groups across the state. We estimate hundreds of families may have been victimized without realizing they were targets of organized crime rather than simple family conflicts. As we prepared to leave Detective Harrison's office, he handed us a thick folder of recovered items that belonged to Grandpa's family. We'll need you to identify your possessions among the recovered items, but I wanted you to know that we've already located many of the family heirlooms that were stolen from your home. Walking out of the sheriff's office, I felt a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that the criminals were in custody and that we'd recovered many stolen family treasures. Horror at discovering that our personal family tragedy was part of a massive criminal enterprise that had been devastating families across Pennsylvania. But Detective Harrison's final warning stayed with me as we drove back to the farm. This investigation is going to attract significant media attention once the arrests become public knowledge. Be prepared for reporters to contact you and consider carefully how much you want to share about your personal experience. The fight for justice was about to become very public, which meant new challenges we hadn't anticipated were heading our way. The phone started ringing at 6:15 the next morning. By 7 o'clock, 3 news vans were parked at the end of Grandpa's gravel driveway, their satellite antennas extended toward the cloudy Pennsylvania sky like mechanical flowers reaching for light. Investigative reporter Amanda Collins from WPGH-TV had received a tip from Detective Harrison's office about the major elder fraud bust, and she'd identified our family as the key victims whose case had exposed the entire criminal network. Ms. Hoffman, I'm Amanda Collins from Channel 11 News, she said when I finally answered the persistent knocking on the front door. I'd like to speak with you about the elder fraud investigation that led to yesterday's arrests. Amanda was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with the kind of determined energy that suggested she'd built her career on exposing exactly these kinds of criminal schemes. Her cameraman waited respectfully by the porch steps while she explained her investigation. Detective Harrison told me that your family's experience was instrumental in uncovering this criminal network. I believe telling your story could help other families recognize similar warning signs and protect themselves from these predators. Part of me wanted to slam the door and hide from the cameras, but another part recognized the opportunity to turn our personal nightmare into something that might help others. Let me talk to my grandfather, I said, closing the door gently. Grandpa Walter sat at his kitchen table, still wearing his old flannel robe and looking overwhelmed by the sudden media attention. What do you think, Grandpa, should we tell our story? He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the news vans and reporters setting up equipment. Your grandmother always said that when something bad happens to you, you should try to find a way to help other people so the same bad thing doesn't happen to them, he said finally. Maybe if we tell people what Robert and Patricia did, other families won't have to go through what we've been through. An hour later, Amanda Collins and her camera crew had set up in Grandpa's living room, positioning lights and cameras to capture both of us sitting on the old sofa where 4 generations of our family had shared stories. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours, during which we walked Amanda through the entire chronology of betrayal and discovery. She was particularly interested in the sophisticated methods used to target and manipulate elderly victims. What I want viewers to understand, Amanda said during a break in filming, is that this wasn't just simple theft. This was psychological warfare designed to isolate elderly people from their support systems and make them doubt their own competence. When the story aired that evening at 6 o'clock, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The news station's phone lines were flooded with calls from families across western Pennsylvania reporting similar experiences. Good evening, I'm Amanda Collins with a Channel 11 investigation that reveals a sophisticated elder fraud network that police say has victimized dozens of families across 3 counties. The story opened with footage of Detective Harrison's evidence room, showing tables covered with recovered family heirlooms and photographs of the storage facilities where stolen goods had been warehoused. At the center of this investigation is the story of Yvette Hoffman, whose parents refused to come to the hospital when she was critically injured in a car accident, but who had been systematically stealing from her grandfather for over a year. Amanda's report was devastating in its clarity. She explained how the criminal network identified vulnerable elderly targets, the sophisticated legal documentation used to legitimize theft, and the psychological manipulation employed to isolate victims from family support. The most powerful moment came when the camera focused on Grandpa Walter holding his late wife's jewelry box, which had been recovered from the storage facility. "They sold my Martha's jewelry box for $35, he said quietly. "I made that for her for our 20th wedding anniversary. It took me 3 months to carve all those flowers by hand, and they sold it like it was just some piece of junk from a garage sale." Within hours of the story airing, Amanda's email inbox was overflowing with similar accounts from viewers who recognized their own experiences in our family's story. The Patterson family from Allegheny County contacted the news station after seeing familiar family photographs in the recovered evidence footage. Margaret Patterson's son had sold her antique collection using identical methods, and the family had been torn apart by accusations and distrust. The Williams family from Butler County called to report that their elderly father's estate planning had been manipulated under circumstances nearly identical to Grandpa's experience. Most shocking was a call from the Rodriguez family in Erie County, who recognized several pieces of their grandmother's jewelry in the evidence footage. They'd been told the items were lost in a house fire, but seeing them in police custody revealed that family members had been lying about their disappearance. Amanda's follow-up investigation aired 3 days later, featuring interviews with 5 additional families who'd been victimized by the same criminal network. The scope of the emotional and financial damage was staggering. What we've discovered is that this criminal network wasn't just stealing money and possessions, Amanda reported. They were systematically destroying families by turning relatives against each other and making elderly victims doubt their own perceptions of reality. The most devastating interview featured an elderly woman from Washington County whose daughter had convinced her she was developing dementia while secretly liquidating her life savings. The woman had spent 6 months believing she was losing her mind before discovering that her confusion was caused by her medication being tampered with. The psychological abuse is often more damaging than the financial theft, explained Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a geriatrician who specialized in elder abuse cases. Victims lose trust in their own judgment, become isolated from family members who might help them, and often develop depression and anxiety from the constant manipulation. The public response to Amanda's investigation was unprecedented. The district attorney's office was flooded with tips about potential victims and suspicious activity. Adult Protective Services received dozens of calls from families requesting welfare checks on elderly relatives. Most importantly, state legislators announced plans to introduce new laws strengthening penalties for elder fraud and requiring additional safeguards for estate planning involving elderly clients. The devastating twist came during Amanda's final report when she revealed that investigators had discovered evidence suggesting similar criminal networks were operating in at least 6 other states, using identical methods and sometimes involving the same key players. What started as a local investigation into one family's betrayal has uncovered what federal authorities now believe may be a national elder fraud epidemic, Amanda concluded. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states are now coordinating efforts to identify and prosecute these criminal networks. Standing on Grandpa's front porch, watching the news crews pack up their equipment after a week of intensive coverage, I realized our personal nightmare had become a catalyst for protecting thousands of other families from similar betrayal. But I also understood that going public with our story meant we'd forever be known as the family whose parents were professional criminals who specialized in exploiting the elderly. The price of justice was going to be more complicated than I'd anticipated. 3 weeks after the media coverage exploded across Pennsylvania, Detective Harrison called with urgent news that sent chills through both Grandpa and me. "Your parents made bail this morning," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Their attorney posted bond using property they claimed as collateral, and they were released pending trial." My blood ran cold. How is that possible? I thought the charges were serious enough to keep them in custody. The judge determined they weren't flight risks based on their community ties and lack of prior criminal history, Detective Harrison explained. "But Yvette, there's something else you need to know. Our surveillance team lost track of them within 2 hours of their release." Grandpa's face went pale as he listened to my end of the phone conversation. The thought of my parents roaming free, desperate, and facing years in prison was terrifying enough, but knowing they deliberately evaded police surveillance suggested they were planning something drastic. "We've issued alerts to all airports, bus stations, and border crossings," Detective Harrison continued. "We've also placed protective surveillance on your grandfather's property and contacted local law enforcement to increase patrols in your area." That evening, as we tried to maintain some sense of normalcy despite the police car parked at the end of our driveway, Grandpa and I sat in his kitchen trying to process this latest development. "I keep thinking about that look in Robert's eyes during the court hearing," Grandpa said quietly. "It wasn't just anger or embarrassment. It was desperation, like a trapped animal that might do anything to escape." His observation proved more prescient than either of us realized. The next morning, Detective Harrison's phone call woke us before dawn. "They tried to flee the state," he said without preamble. "Airport security arrested them at Pittsburgh International Airport at 11:45 last night. They were attempting to board a red-eye flight to Miami using fake identification documents." Relief flooded through me, but Detective Harrison's next words revealed just how desperate their escape attempt had been. When security searched their luggage, they found over $50,000 in cash, multiple sets of false identity papers, and portable hard drives containing detailed records of their criminal activities. $50,000, I gasped. Money from liquidating additional stolen items over the past month. While out on bail, they used their remaining access to storage facilities to sell off inventory before we could seize it. They also withdrew funds from hidden bank accounts we hadn't yet discovered. The revelation that my parents had continued their criminal activities even after being arrested demonstrated a level of shamelessness that defied comprehension. They'd used their brief freedom to steal even more from their victims, knowing they were facing serious prison time. "But here's the most disturbing part," Detective Harrison continued. "The false identification documents weren't amateur fakes. They were professionally produced papers that suggest connections to organized crime networks beyond what we'd previously identified." Grandpa and I drove to the sheriff's office later that morning to see the evidence that had been recovered from my parents' failed escape attempt. The sight of their desperate preparations was both shocking and pathetic. The fake IDs showed them as Richard and Paula Henderson, complete with social security numbers, birth certificates, and even fabricated employment histories. The portable hard drives contained detailed financial records showing the full scope of their criminal enterprise, including victims' names, stolen property inventories, and money laundering transactions. They kept meticulous records. Detective Harrison explained, scrolling through spreadsheets that documented their crimes with business-like efficiency. Names, addresses, estimated asset values, psychological profiles of elderly targets, even notes about which family members might be susceptible to manipulation. Most chilling was a document titled Expansion Plans that outlined their intentions to replicate their Pennsylvania operation in Florida and Texas, targeting retirement communities and assisted living facilities with high concentrations of wealthy, elderly residents. They weren't just stealing from families, Detective Harrison said grimly. They were building a criminal enterprise with plans for nationwide expansion. Among the recovered evidence was a handwritten note that made my stomach turn. It was my father's handwriting, apparently written while they were planning their escape. Can't let Yvette and the old man destroy everything we've built. 3 years of work down the drain because she had to play detective. Need to relocate and start over somewhere they can't find us. The casual reference to the old man when talking about Grandpa Walter, combined with their complete lack of remorse for destroying our family, revealed the depth of their moral bankruptcy. "There's one more thing," Detective Harrison said, handing me a manila envelope. "This was in your mother's purse when they were arrested." Inside was a real estate contract for the sale of Grandpa's farm to a development company. The contract was dated for the day after their planned departure to Miami and included forged signatures authorizing the sale. They were going to sell the farm remotely using fraudulent power of attorney documents, Detective Harrison explained. The $800,000 sale price would have financed their new criminal operation in Florida. The devastating twist was that even in their desperate flight from justice, my parents had planned one final theft that would have stripped Grandpa of his family's 4-generation legacy. They weren't just stealing objects and money anymore. They were attempting to erase our family's entire history for the sake of funding their criminal future. As we left the sheriff's office that afternoon, I felt a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that they'd been caught before completing their escape. Horror at discovering the calculated cruelty behind their every action. "You know what hurts the most," Grandpa said as we drove home through the autumn countryside. "It's not the stolen property or even the money. It's realizing that Robert never loved this farm or our family the way I thought he did. To him, it was all just assets to be liquidated." The criminal charges against my parents had been upgraded to include attempted flight to avoid prosecution, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit fraud across state lines. They were now facing federal charges in addition to state charges, with potential sentences of 15 to 20 years in prison. But more than the legal consequences, their failed escape attempt had revealed the true scope of their betrayal. They hadn't just stolen from our family. They'd been building a criminal empire designed to destroy families across multiple states, and our grandmother's jewelry box was just the beginning of their planned devastation. The trial was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks, and prosecutor assured us that the evidence recovered from their escape attempt would virtually guarantee conviction on all charges. Justice was finally within reach, but the emotional scars from discovering the depth of their criminal planning would take much longer to heal. The courthouse in downtown Pittsburgh had never felt more imposing than it did on the morning of my parents' sentencing hearing. After 3 weeks of testimony, evidence presentation, and legal arguments, Judge Patricia Williamson was finally ready to deliver her verdict and determine the consequences for the criminal enterprise that had destroyed so many families. Grandpa Walter sat beside me in the gallery, wearing his only suit and looking every bit the dignified farmer who'd spent 78 years building a life based on honesty and hard work. The contrast between his quiet integrity and the defendant's table where my parents sat in orange jumpsuits was stark and heartbreaking. District Attorney Michael Chen had built an overwhelming case, using the evidence recovered from my parents' storage facilities' financial records, victim testimonies, and the materials seized during their failed escape attempt. The prosecution had called 12 witnesses over 3 weeks, including elderly victims from 6 different families and expert witnesses who explained the sophisticated nature of the criminal conspiracy. Your Honor, the defendants operated a criminal enterprise that systematically targeted the most vulnerable members of our community. D.A. Chen said during his closing arguments. They didn't just steal money and possessions, they weaponized family love and trust to destroy relationships and isolate elderly victims from the support systems that might have protected them. My parents' defense attorney, a tired-looking man who'd clearly recognized the hopelessness of his client's situation, had attempted to argue for leniency based on their lack of prior criminal history and claims of financial desperation, but the mountain of evidence made any defense nearly impossible. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Grandpa Walter took the witness stand to deliver his victim impact statement. His voice was strong and clear as he addressed the judge directly. Your Honor, my son Robert and his wife Patricia stole more than family heirlooms from me. They stole my trust, my peace of mind, and my faith in family bonds that I thought were unbreakable. But most painfully, they stole precious time. Time I could have spent enjoying my golden years instead of wondering why my own son was treating me like an enemy. Grandpa's testimony continued with devastating clarity as he described the isolation and confusion caused by their manipulation. They made me doubt my own memory and judgment. They convinced me I was becoming incompetent when I was actually being systematically deceived. They turned my love for them into a weapon they used against me and other elderly victims. When the defense attorney attempted to cross-examine Grandpa, asking whether he'd consider forgiveness for family members who were struggling financially, Grandpa's response was firm and uncompromising. Sir, struggling financially doesn't justify destroying families and preying on elderly people. If Robert and Patricia needed help, they could have asked. Instead, they chose to build a criminal business that traumatized dozens of families across Pennsylvania. That's not financial struggle. That's calculated evil. The prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showed my parents had generated over $200,000 through their criminal activities. Witness testimony from 15 victim families painted a picture of systematic predatory behavior. Expert analysis of the forged documents revealed sophisticated criminal planning involving corrupt legal professionals. But the most damning evidence was the materials recovered from their failed escape attempt, including detailed plans for expanding their criminal operation to multiple states and the attempted fraudulent sale of Grandpa's farm. Judge Williamson's verdict was swift and decisive. The defendants operated a sophisticated criminal enterprise that targeted elderly victims with surgical precision, she said from the bench. They exploited family relationships, manipulated legal systems, and caused immeasurable harm to multiple families across our community. The judge sentenced my father Robert to 12 years in federal prison on charges including elder fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and attempted flight to avoid prosecution. My mother, Patricia, received 10 years on similar charges with a slight reduction, reflecting her lesser role in the legal document forgery. But Judge Williamson's most significant ruling addressed the financial restitution and civil consequences of their crimes. The defendants are ordered to pay full restitution totaling $347,000 to all identified victims, including the value of stolen property, emotional damages, and legal expenses incurred by families seeking to protect their elderly relatives. The judge also granted Grandpa Walter's petition for emergency guardianship protection, which would prevent any future attempts to manipulate his legal documents or financial decisions. Furthermore, Judge Williamson continued, I'm ordering the immediate return of all recovered property to victim families, along with the liquidation of defendants' assets to satisfy restitution obligations. The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration as families who'd been victimized by the criminal network finally heard that justice would be served. I watched elderly victims and their adult children embrace with relief, knowing that their stolen family treasures would be returned and their financial losses compensated. But Judge Williamson wasn't finished. Her final comments addressed the broader implications of the case for protecting elderly community members. This case has revealed systematic vulnerabilities in our legal and social systems that allow predators to exploit elderly citizens with impunity. I'm recommending legislative action to strengthen elder protection laws and requiring additional oversight for estate planning involving elderly clients. As the judge's gavel fell, I felt a mixture of justice and sadness. Justice because the criminals who destroyed so many families were finally being held accountable. Sadness because the family I'd grown up believing in had turned out to be an illusion built on lies and manipulation. When the bailiff led my parents away in shackles, neither of them looked back at Grandpa or me. Even facing 12 years in prison, they showed no remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain they'd caused, no recognition that their victims were human beings rather than business opportunities. Outside the courthouse, DA Chen held a press conference announcing that the successful prosecution had generated tips leading to similar investigations in 4 other states. The criminal network my parents had been part of was apparently much larger than anyone had initially realized. This case demonstrates that elder fraud is not just a family problem, DA Chen told reporters. It's an organized crime issue that requires coordinated law enforcement response and community vigilance to protect our most vulnerable citizens. As Grandpa and I drove home through the Pennsylvania countryside that afternoon, we passed the storage facility where his stolen belongings had been warehoused, like inventory in a criminal business. The building was now empty. Its contents returned to their rightful families. Its role in destroying trust between family members finally ended. "It's over," Grandpa said quietly as we turned into his gravel driveway. But I knew it wasn't really over. The legal chapter might be closed, but the emotional healing would take much longer. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I was already thinking about how we could use our painful experience to help other families avoid similar betrayal. Justice had been served, but our real work was just beginning. 2 weeks after the sentencing, District Attorney Chen organized something unprecedented, a community ceremony for returning stolen family heirlooms to their rightful families. The event was held at the Pittsburgh Convention Center, transforming a sterile meeting space into something resembling a massive family reunion where lost treasures were reunited with the people who treasured them. Local newspapers had coordinated with law enforcement to publicize the event, and the response was overwhelming. Families arrived from across western Pennsylvania, many bringing photo albums and documentation to help identify their stolen possessions among the hundreds of recovered items. The sight of 12 long tables covered with family treasures was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Antique furniture, jewelry collections, family photographs, handmade quilts, military medals, and countless other irreplaceable items were arranged with care by volunteers who understood that each piece represented generations of family history. Grandpa Walter and I arrived early, but we weren't the first family there. An elderly woman named Margaret Patterson was already examining items with tears streaming down her cheeks, having just located her mother's china set that she'd believed was lost forever. "I've been looking for these pieces for over a year," she told the volunteer assisting her. "My son told me they were broken during his move, but seeing them here means he'd been lying to me all along." The emotional weight of the ceremony was almost overwhelming. Each recovered item represented not just financial theft, but the betrayal of trust between family members who should have protected each other. Amanda Collins from Channel 11 was there to document the event, but she worked respectfully in the background, understanding that this was about healing rather than news coverage. "This ceremony represents more than just returning stolen property," she explained to her viewers during the evening broadcast. "It's about restoring faith in family bonds and community support systems that these criminals tried to destroy." When Grandpa found his late wife's jewelry box among the recovered items, he held it with the reverence of someone handling a sacred relic. The wooden chest that he'd carved by hand 50 years ago showed signs of rough handling, but the intricate flower patterns were still clearly visible. "Martha would be so happy to know it's coming home," he whispered, running his weathered fingers over the carved roses. But the most powerful moment came when we discovered items that didn't belong to our family mixed in with our possessions. Someone had carefully placed a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon inside Martha's jewelry box. The letters were love notes between strangers written during World War II by a soldier to his sweetheart back home. They belonged to another family entirely, but had somehow become intertwined with our stolen belongings during the criminal operation. "We need to find who these belong to," Grandpa said immediately. The volunteer coordinator helped us identify the letters' rightful family, and we walked across the convention center to personally return them to an elderly man named Frank Morrison, who'd been searching for his parents' wartime correspondence. "These letters are all I have left of my father," Frank said with tears in his eyes. "He died in France just 3 months before the war ended, and these were the last words he wrote to my mother." The ceremony transformed from individual recovery into community healing as families helped each other identify belongings, shared stories about their stolen treasures, and formed support networks for dealing with the ongoing emotional trauma of family betrayal. Local businesses had donated services to help restore damaged items. A furniture restoration company offered free refinishing for antique pieces. A jewelry repair shop volunteered to fix damaged family heirlooms. A photography studio provided digital archiving services for recovered family photographs. What these criminals tried to destroy was our sense of community and trust, explained Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the geriatrician who'd become an advocate for elder abuse prevention. This ceremony is about rebuilding those connections and proving that compassion is stronger than greed. The most unexpected moment came when Thomas Richardson, the family attorney who'd helped expose the criminal scheme, announced the establishment of a legal aid fund for elder fraud victims. "Too many families can't afford legal representation when elderly relatives are being exploited," he said during a brief speech. "This fund will provide free legal services to families facing similar situations, ensuring that financial limitations don't prevent people from protecting their loved ones." Local banks had also responded to the crisis by implementing new safeguards for elderly customers. Special procedures were now required for large transactions or estate planning changes involving customers over 75 years old. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from the elderly victims themselves, who formed an informal support group for families recovering from elder fraud trauma. "We understand what each other has been through in ways that other people can't," explained Dorothy, Grandpa's neighbor, who'd provided crucial evidence early in our investigation. "When your own family betrays you, it helps to talk to other people who've survived similar experiences." The support group met monthly at the community center near Grandpa's farm, providing a safe space for elderly victims to discuss their experiences, share coping strategies, and rebuild their confidence in making independent decisions. "What we learned is that isolation makes elderly people vulnerable to exploitation," Dorothy continued. "By staying connected to each other and the broader community, we can protect ourselves and watch out for warning signs that someone might be targeting our neighbors." As the ceremony concluded that evening, I watched families loading their recovered treasures into cars and trucks, finally able to bring their heritage home. The criminals had tried to turn family history into profit margins, but the community response had transformed our shared trauma into collective strength. The local newspaper established a tip line for reporting suspected elder fraud, encouraging community members to contact authorities if they noticed concerning changes in elderly neighbors' circumstances or relationships with adult children. Most importantly, state legislators had responded to the media coverage by fast-tracking elder protection legislation that would require additional safeguards for power of attorney documents and estate planning involving elderly clients. "This case has awakened our community to a problem that was hiding in plain sight," DA Chen told reporters. "But the response has shown that when we work together to protect our most vulnerable citizens, we can create systems that prevent these crimes from happening in the first place." Driving home from the ceremony with Grandpa's recovered treasures carefully secured in my truck bed, I realized that something beautiful had emerged from our family's nightmare. Our personal tragedy had sparked a community-wide effort to protect elderly residents and strengthen the bonds between generations. The criminals had tried to isolate and exploit elderly people, but their actions had instead brought the community together in ways that would protect countless families from similar betrayal. Our stolen family heirlooms were finally coming home, but more importantly, we'd helped create a support system that would safeguard other families for years to come. 6 months after the community ceremony, I was sitting in Grandpa's kitchen organizing the recovered family photographs when he surprised me with a revelation that changed everything I thought I understood about the past year. "Yvette, there's something I need to tell you," he said, settling into his favorite chair with a cup of coffee and a mischievous twinkle in his eyes that I hadn't seen in months. "I wasn't as helpless as your parents thought I was." I looked up from the photo albums, confused by his sudden change in demeanor. "What do you mean, Grandpa?" He chuckled softly, the sound filled with satisfaction rather than bitterness. "I suspected something was wrong months before you discovered their online sales. Items were disappearing from the house, and Robert and Patricia were asking too many questions about my finances and legal documents." My heart stopped. "You knew they were stealing from you." "Not the full extent, but I knew something wasn't right, so I took some precautions." Grandpa walked to his bedroom and returned with a manila folder I'd never seen before. Inside were documents that made me gasp with surprise and admiration. Last January, 3 months before they got me to sign those fraudulent power of attorney papers, I quietly transferred the most valuable assets to accounts they couldn't access. He spread the documents across the kitchen table, showing me records of transactions I'd never known about. I moved most of my savings to a trust account with Thomas Richardson as the trustee. I updated my insurance policies to name you as the primary beneficiary. Most importantly, I changed the deed on this farm to include your name as co-owner. I stared at the documents in amazement. "Grandpa, you protected everything." "Not everything. I let them take some items because I was gathering evidence of their theft. I wanted to give Robert a chance to change his behavior, but I also wanted to protect the family legacy in case he didn't." The revelation was stunning. While I'd been feeling sorry for Grandpa as a helpless victim, he'd actually been conducting his own investigation and taking steps to safeguard our family's future. "You were playing detective too?" He laughed, looking more like the sharp, independent man I'd always known him to be. 78 years of living teaches you to be careful when people start acting differently around money. I may be old, but I'm not naive. Grandpa pulled out another folder containing photographs and notes he'd been secretly documenting. "I took pictures every time items went missing from the house. I kept track of Robert and Patricia's visits and which rooms they spent time in. I even recorded some of their conversations when they thought I wasn't listening carefully." The evidence he'd collected was extensive and methodical. Photos of empty spaces where antiques used to sit, notes about suspicious behavior during family visits, audio recordings of conversations where my parents discussed their plans for liquidating family assets. "Why didn't you tell me about this earlier?" I asked, still processing the implications. "Because I wanted to see how far they'd go, and I wanted to make sure you were safe before I revealed what I knew. When you called me from the hospital after your accident and they refused to come, I knew our family was in serious trouble." Grandpa's strategic thinking during the crisis had been remarkable. He'd allowed my parents to believe they were successfully manipulating him while he gathered evidence and protected the most important assets. The farmland they thought they were going to inherit, I'd already transferred half ownership to you months before they changed my will. The fraudulent estate planning documents they created were worthless because the property wasn't mine to bequeath anymore. So, when they tried to sell the farm during their escape attempt, they were trying to sell property they didn't legally control. Grandpa finished with satisfaction. Thomas Richardson and I had been planning to reveal the true ownership structure during their trial, but their escape attempt made it unnecessary. The most touching revelation came when Grandpa showed me a letter he'd written to me 6 months earlier, sealed and dated, explaining his actions and his hopes for my future. I wanted you to know that even if something happened to me before this situation was resolved, I tried to protect what your grandmother and I built for you. Reading the letter, which expressed his complete faith in my character and his determination to preserve our family legacy despite his son's betrayal, brought tears to my eyes. You know what I'm most proud of, Grandpa continued. Not the money I saved or the property I protected. I'm proud that you fought for me even when you thought I was helpless. That showed me that our family values survived in you, even though they didn't survive in your father. The conversation continued for hours as Grandpa revealed the full scope of his protective measures and his quiet investigation into my parents' activities. His apparent vulnerability had been partially strategic, designed to document their crimes while safeguarding our family's future. I learned something important during this whole experience, he said as we finished organizing the recovered photographs. Real strength isn't about being invulnerable to betrayal. Real strength is about protecting the people you love while staying true to your values even when your own family turns against you. That evening, as we sat on the front porch watching the sunset over the farmland that would someday be mine, Grandpa shared the wisdom that had guided him through the darkest period of his life. Your grandmother used to say that every crisis reveals what people are really made of inside. Robert and Patricia's crisis revealed greed and selfishness. Your crisis revealed loyalty and courage. My crisis revealed that love is stronger than blood when blood turns toxic. The realization that Grandpa had been protecting our family's future while I thought I was protecting him changed my entire understanding of our relationship. We weren't just grandfather and granddaughter. We were partners in preserving something precious that transcended individual family members. What happens now? I asked as stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Now we heal, Grandpa said simply. And we figure out how to use what we've learned to help other families avoid what we went through. His words planted a seed that would grow into something I'd never expected, a sense of purpose that emerged from our shared trauma and transformed our pain into a force for protecting others. The healing process was just beginning, but I finally understood that sometimes the worst experiences in life become doorways to discovering strengths and purposes you never knew you possessed. 8 months after my parents' sentencing, I was sitting in a cramped office space in downtown Pittsburgh, surrounded by moving boxes and the excited energy of starting something entirely new. The sign on the door read, Elder Protection Alliance. And I was about to open the doors on a nonprofit organization that had grown from our family's nightmare into a beacon of hope for vulnerable elderly citizens across Pennsylvania. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After spending months processing the trauma and helping other families navigate their own elder fraud cases, I'd gradually realized that my experience had given me unique insights into both the criminal methods used to exploit elderly people and the emotional healing required for families recovering from betrayal. Thomas Richardson had offered me a partnership in his law firm, recognizing that my personal experience combined with my marketing background made me uniquely qualified to help elder fraud victims. But I'd realized that what the community needed was something broader than traditional legal services. We need an organization that addresses both the practical and emotional aspects of elder exploitation, I'd explained to Thomas during one of our planning meetings. Legal representation is crucial, but families also need counseling, financial planning, community education, and ongoing support systems. Detective Harrison had enthusiastically endorsed the concept, offering to provide law enforcement expertise and help develop educational programs for identifying and preventing elder fraud. What you're proposing could prevent dozens of families from going through what yours experienced, he'd said. Early intervention and community education are the keys to stopping these criminals before they can establish patterns of exploitation. Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the Geriatrics Department had agreed to serve as our medical advisor, helping develop screening protocols for healthcare workers to identify potential elder abuse situations. But the most meaningful endorsement had come from the informal support group of elder fraud survivors that had formed after the community ceremony. Dorothy Grandpa's neighbor had become the group's informal leader and immediately offered to help establish peer counseling services. Who better to help elder fraud victims than other people who've survived similar experiences? She'd asked. We understand the shame, the confusion, and the family trauma in ways that professional counselors, however well-meaning, simply cannot. The Elder Protection Alliance officially opened on a crisp autumn morning exactly 1 year after my car accident. Our services included legal advocacy, family counseling, financial planning assistance, community education programs, and a 24-hour hotline for reporting suspected elder abuse. Our first client was Margaret Patterson, the elderly woman whose son had stolen her antique collection. She'd been struggling with depression and trust issues long after recovering her possessions, and traditional therapy hadn't addressed the specific trauma of family betrayal. I don't know how to trust my own judgment anymore, she confided during our initial meeting. If I couldn't recognize that my own son was stealing from me, how can I trust myself to make any important decisions? Working with Margaret revealed the long-term psychological damage caused by elder fraud that extended far beyond financial losses. Victims often developed chronic anxiety about their mental competence, became socially isolated due to shame about the betrayal, and struggled with depression from losing faith in family relationships. The criminals don't just steal money and possessions, I explained to a reporter who was covering our organization's launch. They steal their victims' confidence, independence, and sense of safety in the world. Recovery requires rebuilding all of those things, not just returning stolen property. Our educational programs quickly gained attention from healthcare providers, senior community centers, and law enforcement agencies across Western Pennsylvania. We developed presentations that helped families recognize warning signs of elder exploitation and created resources for elderly individuals to protect themselves from manipulation. But the most innovative aspect of our organization was the victim advocacy program, where elder fraud survivors like Dorothy provided peer support to new victims navigating the criminal justice system. When someone calls our hotline reporting that their family member is being exploited, we don't just give them a lawyer's phone number, Dorothy explained to a gathering of social workers. We connect them with someone who's walked the same path, someone who understands that this isn't just a legal problem, but a family crisis that affects everyone involved. Within 6 months, we were helping 12 new families per month and had expanded our services to 3 additional counties. The State Attorney General's office contacted us about developing statewide educational programs, and federal agencies were interested in replicating our model in other states. The personal transformation that came from building the organization was unexpected and profound. The marketing skills I developed in my previous career proved invaluable for public education campaigns. The trauma I'd experienced gave me credibility with victims who might otherwise be skeptical of professional help. Most importantly, the deep empathy I developed for elderly people who'd been betrayed by their families became the foundation for everything we accomplished. You've found your calling, Grandpa observed one evening as I excitedly described a new partnership with the State Banking Association to train employees in recognizing elder fraud warning signs. He was right. The work felt like more than just a career change. It felt like destiny, as if everything I'd experienced had been preparation for this specific purpose. The most satisfying moment came when we received a call from a family in Ohio who'd used our online resources to identify and stop an elder exploitation scheme before significant damage occurred. Their elderly father's caregiver had been systematically stealing from him, and the family had recognized the warning signs from our educational materials. We caught it early because we knew what to look for, the daughter explained during a grateful phone call. Your organization helped us save our father's dignity and our family relationships before they could be destroyed. By the end of our first year, the Elder Protection Alliance had helped over 150 families, prevented an estimated $2 million in elder fraud losses, and established support networks that were protecting vulnerable elderly citizens across 4 states. But more than the statistics, I was proud of the emotional healing we'd facilitated for families recovering from betrayal. Grandpa had become one of our most effective volunteer speakers, sharing his story with audiences across Pennsylvania and helping other elderly victims understand that survival was possible. What we learned is that family isn't just about blood relationships, he would tell audiences. Family is about love, loyalty, and the commitment to protect each other. Sometimes the people who share your DNA aren't really your family, and sometimes the people who choose to love and support you become the family that matters most. The organization had given both Grandpa and me a sense of purpose that transformed our painful experience into something meaningful and hopeful. We weren't just survivors of elder fraud anymore. We were advocates, educators, and healers who were using our trauma to protect others from similar devastation. Standing in my office late one evening, looking at thank you letters from families we'd helped and planning materials for next month's educational programs, I realized that sometimes life's greatest tragedies become doorways to discovering purposes you never could have imagined. My parents had tried to destroy our family through greed and manipulation, but their actions had ultimately led me to discover work that was more fulfilling and meaningful than anything I'd ever done before. The girl who'd been abandoned in a hospital by her own parents had become a woman who dedicated her life to ensuring that no elderly person would face similar abandonment. Justice wasn't just about prison sentences and recovered property. Justice was about transforming pain into purpose and ensuring that our family's nightmare became other families' protection. 2 years after my car accident changed everything, I stood in the same hospital where this entire journey began, but this time I was there as a volunteer coordinator for the Elder Protection Alliance's new medical partnership program. The Trauma Center had invited us to train their staff in recognizing signs of elder abuse and connecting victims with appropriate resources. Walking through those familiar corridors, I thought about how dramatically my life had transformed since the night I lay in this emergency room, bleeding and abandoned by the people who should have loved me most. The scared young woman who'd called Grandpa Walter in desperation had evolved into someone who'd found purpose in protecting other vulnerable elderly people from similar betrayal. The training session that morning was particularly meaningful because it included many of the same nurses and doctors who'd cared for me during my darkest hours. Dr. Martinez, the surgeon who'd saved my life, introduced me to the medical staff with obvious pride. Yvette represents something remarkable, he told the assembled healthcare workers. She transformed personal trauma into a force for community healing. Her organization has prevented countless elderly patients from experiencing the kind of family abandonment she survived. After the presentation, during which we trained 60 healthcare workers in elder fraud prevention protocols, I drove to Grandpa's farm for our weekly Sunday dinner. The farmhouse looked exactly the same as it had 2 years earlier, but everything about our relationship and our lives had been transformed by the challenges we'd faced together. Grandpa Walter, now 80 years old, was busier than ever with his volunteer work for the Elder Protection Alliance and his role as a peer counselor for elder fraud victims. The man who'd once been isolated and targeted by criminals had become a powerful advocate for elderly rights and a symbol of resilience for families recovering from betrayal. "You know what I realized today?" he said as we sat on his front porch watching the sunset paint the Pennsylvania hills in shades of gold and crimson. "When Robert and Patricia abandoned you in that hospital, they thought they were choosing their criminal enterprise over family loyalty. But what they actually did was push you toward discovering your true calling." His observation sparked a reflection that had been developing in my mind for months. The car accident that had seemed like such a devastating tragedy had actually been the catalyst for positive changes I never could have imagined. If they'd come to the hospital that night, if they'd acted like loving parents instead of criminals, would I have ever discovered what they were doing to you? I wondered aloud. Probably not, Grandpa admitted. I might have continued believing their lies and manipulation until they'd successfully gained complete control over my assets and isolated me in institutional care. The ripple effects of that horrible night when my parents texted, "Can't this wait, we're busy," had ultimately saved dozens of families from similar exploitation. Our personal nightmare had exposed a criminal network that was destroying families across multiple states. My near-death experience had led to discovering work that was more meaningful than any career I'd ever imagined. I learned something important about the difference between family and relatives. I said, watching the last light fade from the western sky. Relatives are just people who happen to share your DNA. Family are the people who choose to love you, support you, and sacrifice for your welfare. Grandpa nodded with the wisdom of someone who'd lived long enough to understand that relationships are defined by actions rather than blood connections. Your parents were my relatives, but you became my family when you chose to fight for me, even when you thought I was helpless. The volunteers at our organization, the victims we help, the community members who support our work, they're all family too. That evening, as we reviewed letters from families the Elder Protection Alliance had helped during the past month, I reflected on the profound life lessons that had emerged from our shared trauma. The first lesson was about recognizing authentic relationships. True love reveals itself during crisis when people have choices about how much they're willing to sacrifice for others. My parents had chosen their criminal profits over my life, while Grandpa had chosen my welfare over his own comfort and safety. The second lesson was about finding strength through adversity. The challenges that seem designed to destroy us often become the foundations for discovering capabilities and purposes we never knew we possessed. My car accident had led to uncovering my parents' crimes, which had led to building an organization that protected vulnerable elderly people throughout Pennsylvania. The third lesson was about the power of community. Individual trauma can be transformed into collective healing when we choose to share our experiences and use our pain to protect others. Our family's private nightmare had become a public force for positive change that was preventing similar tragedies from destroying other families. The fourth lesson was about the difference between justice and revenge. Justice meant ensuring that criminals face consequences for their actions and that their victims receive support and restitution. But true justice also meant using our experience to build systems that would prevent future crimes rather than simply punishing past ones. The most profound lesson was about discovering meaning through suffering. Some experiences are so painful that they permanently change who we are and how we understand the world. But those same experiences can become sources of wisdom, compassion, and purpose that enable us to help other people navigate similar challenges. "You know what's funny?" I said as we prepared to go inside for the evening. "If someone had told me 2 years ago that my parents' betrayal would lead to the most fulfilling work of my life, I would have thought they were crazy." Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become doorways to the best things we never could have planned, Grandpa replied. "Your grandmother used to say that God works in mysterious ways, and I think she would have been amazed to see how your accident led to protecting so many elderly people from exploitation." As we walked into the farmhouse that had been saved from my parents' criminal scheme, I thought about all the families who were safer because of the Elder Protection Alliance's work. The organization we'd built from our family's ashes was now helping an average of 30 families per month, had prevented over $5 million in elder fraud losses, and had trained thousands of healthcare workers, law enforcement officers, and community members in recognizing and preventing elder exploitation. But beyond the statistics, I was most proud of the emotional healing we'd facilitated for families recovering from the devastating betrayal of elder fraud. We'd help victims rebuild their confidence, reconnect with genuine support systems, and find meaning in their survival. The scared young woman who'd been abandoned in a hospital emergency room had become someone who ensured that no elderly person would face similar abandonment. The grandfather who'd been systematically robbed by his own son had become a powerful advocate for elderly rights and community protection. Our family's nightmare had been transformed into other families' safety net. Before going to sleep that night, I pulled out the stack of thank you letters that families had sent to our organization. Each one represented a tragedy, prevented a family preserved, or an elderly person protected from exploitation. One letter particularly moved me. It was from a woman in Ohio whose elderly mother had been targeted by criminals using methods identical to what my parents had employed. But because the daughter had attended one of our educational presentations, she'd recognized the warning signs and contacted law enforcement before significant damage occurred. "Your organization saved my mother's independence and our family's trust," she'd written. "Thank you for transforming your family's pain into protection for mine." Reading those words, I finally understood the deepest truth about our experience. The car accident that had seemed like senseless tragedy, the family betrayal that had felt like unimaginable cruelty, and the legal battle that had required tremendous courage had all been necessary steps toward discovering work that was more important than anything I'd ever done. Some people find their life's purpose through careful planning and logical career progression. Others discover their calling through trauma that forces them to develop strengths and compassion they never knew they possessed. My purpose had emerged from the ashes of family destruction, but it had become a source of hope and healing that extended far beyond my personal experience. The girl who'd called Grandpa Walter from a hospital bed feeling completely abandoned and alone had grown into a woman who dedicated her life to ensuring that vulnerable elderly people would never face similar abandonment. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the foundations for the best work we'll ever do. The accident that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning. As I drifted off to sleep in the same guest bedroom where I'd recovered from my injuries 2 years earlier, I felt deep gratitude for the winding path that had led me to discover work that felt like destiny rather than just employment. Tomorrow would bring new families to help new educational programs to develop and new opportunities to transform individual pain into community protection. But tonight I was simply grateful to have learned that real family isn't defined by blood relationships, that authentic strength emerges through surviving betrayal with integrity intact, and that sometimes life's greatest tragedies become doorways to discovering purposes more meaningful than anything we could have planned. My parents had tried to destroy our family through greed and manipulation, but their cruelty had ultimately led both Grandpa and me to discover that love, loyalty, and the commitment to protect vulnerable people are more powerful than any criminal scheme. The papers I'd carried to court hadn't just been legal documents seeking justice for our family's betrayal, they'd been the foundation for building something beautiful from something terrible, something protective from something destructive, and something hopeful from something heartbreaking. Real justice wasn't just about punishment. Real justice was about prevention, healing, and transformation. Have you ever experienced a moment when what seemed like a complete disaster actually led to discovering your life's true purpose? I'd love to hear your stories about finding strength through adversity or discovering that family is defined by actions rather than blood relationships. Please share your experiences in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others who might need encouragement about overcoming family betrayal or finding meaning through difficult experiences. Thank you for letting me share our journey with you, and I hope our story helps you recognize that sometimes life's most painful experiences become doorways to purposes more beautiful than anything we could have imagined. Remember that authentic love reveals itself during crisis, and real strength often emerges through surviving betrayal with your values intact.